Good afternoon, good evening, all. Sisters, brothers, comrades, friends, and our allies. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series Workers' Rights Are Not Quarantined. This session takes a rather close look at public services, this particular fourth session, and the workers who deliver those public services to all of us. We have as panelists leaders from public services unions in Anguilla, Bermuda, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. This evening, we're going to be dealing with some status updates that focus on the impact of the various regulatory responses, and we're putting a particular lens on the workers who have to implement those responses. We also want to be looking at the measures that our various trade unions insist must be in place for a safe return to work. We'll look at some examples of some recent calls for salary cuts that governments across the Caribbean are proposing for workers who are delivering the services that we're all craving nowadays. And finally, we'll be looking at what happens in this period where we have to live with COVID 19. I'm hearing people talking about post COVID, but it seems as though we're going to have to live with it for a while. We want to examine the path to recovery, the path to resilience, and what public policies must look like. Now, we have a wonderful panel with us this evening. There are some leaders in their individual unions and also leaders in their national centers. They share their leadership skills not only in the trade union movement, but also in their various communities and in civic organizations in their various countries. Susan Hodge, president of the Anguilla Civil Service Association, and also an assistant general secretary treasurer in the Caribbean Congress of Labor. Armel Thomas, who's president of the Bermuda Public Services Union, and I believe he's also very much involved in the TUC in Bermuda. Brother Ciprian Montrop, who's the president of the Civil Service Association in St. Lucia, and he's also a vice president of the Trade Union Federation in St. Lucia. And Sister Helen Davis White, who's president of the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions and also general secretary of the Jamaica Association of Local Government Officers. We want to be able to look very deeply at some of these measures that are being put in place. And while we know that workers' rights aren't quarantined, we also want to examine what has been happening with our various workers across the Caribbean and certainly by the countries represented here this afternoon. Just to give you a little background into what Public Services International has been doing, um, as Subregional Secretary for Public Services International, we have been also working with our various affiliates. And in fact, the unions represented this evening are our affiliates in the Caribbean, 4 of our 22 affiliates across the Caribbean. And to provide some background information, Public Services International is a global union federation. We represent 30 million workers who are delivering the public services that, unfortunately, in many cases, a lot of us don't pay that much attention to until we arrive at situations like those that we're facing now. So we represent those workers in education services, communication services, public emergency services, the various court services, the civil service proper, quasi government institutions, and of course, health and social care services. Last week, the World Health Assembly held a virtual meeting. The WHA is the decision making body of the World Health Organization. It brings together the governments from 194 countries as member states in order to determine the policies on international health. PSI is one of the non-state actors that represents a number of workers within the health sector. And in fact, we represent the body of health workers. And we participated in that World Health Assembly through interventions dealing with a broad range of technical items on the agenda. We used the opportunity to highlight issues of concern to workers and the public in a response to the pandemic, which has put people's health first. We want to emphasize this. And this is particularly so not only in terms of our work as trade unions, but in terms of the number of declarations that have been made by member states and obviously too by the workers in those member states. We wanted to ensure that there needs to be the application of what is called a precautionary principle, that given the increasing numbers of infection and deaths among healthcare workers, all because of inadequate personal protective equipment, we needed to have WHO update its guidelines so that member states can provide not only the doctors and nurses, but all healthcare workers with suitable respirators and not merely surgical masks. We also stated quite categorically that we wanted to ensure that economic considerations should not define the required PPE and workplace safety, and that member states have to address these shortages in order to save lives. We wanted also to emphasize that WHO's recommendations on physical distancing, the strategy for testing, and long term psychosocial risks seem to us rather inadequate in order to safeguard workers' lives and well being. And we call for those considerations to be reviewed in order to address these, and that there be a consideration of naming COVID-19 as an occupational disease. We wanted as well to have member states consider that all research, data, technology, treatments, vaccines relating to COVID-19 are non-proprietary. They're shared, they should be seen as shared global resources, and they must be supported with full compulsory licensing. And our final demand last week was that we recognize ever so very clearly that understaffing, underfunding, and for profit approaches have weakened healthcare services throughout the world in both the developed and developing countries. And that preparedness and emergency response has also been weakened, and we therefore called on the member states to urgently implement the various plans and guidelines adopted in the Working for Health Plan, which the WH Assembly itself approved and adopted in 2016, based on some recommendations made by a Commission on Health and Economic Growth. Funding of healthcare systems should not be accounted to determine public debt. Sisters and brothers, our particular format this evening is going to take the form of a number of presentations from our various panelists. They'll have 8 minutes to present the main points of their presentations, and then we'll have opportunities for them to further develop those points and also try to ensure that there are more opportunities for you, or listeners or audience, to ask questions and make comments. We're going to take our first two presenters and then have some questions and comments, and then take our another two presenters, more questions and comments, and hopefully have a third round of questions and comments. Allow me to introduce to you, sisters and brothers, Sister Susan Hodge. Susan is president of the Anguilla Civil Service Association, and she's also the assistant general secretary of the Caribbean Congress of Labor. And Susan also works in emergency services as she's a program officer with the Disaster Management Agency in Anguilla. Susan is a committed trade unionist, she's a committed feminist, and we are looking forward very much to hearing Susan's presentation on the situation in Anguilla. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Sister Sandra, and I bring solidarity greetings to all workers, with special thanks to those on the front line. Thank you to the Elma Francois Institute of Cipriani College for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. I am indeed honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. My public sector union colleagues, whom I know well through our many regional meetings and interactions brought about via CPSA and PSI, and more recently, for me at least, the CCL. To our moderator, Sister Sandra Messiah, it is a pleasure to see you again, even if it is virtually. Thank you for your guidance, mentorship, and drive over the years to ensure I continue to play my part in the fight for justice for the worker. Let me give you a little background about my beautiful island. Anguilla is the most northerly of the Leeward Islands, boasting 35 square miles, 16 miles long and 3 miles wide at its widest point. Our highest elevation is 213 feet above sea level, and we have approximately 13,500 warm and friendly people who live and work here. Our economy is mainly tourism-based and followed closely by financial services, fishing, and agriculture. Anguilla is often looked upon as rare in the region, with the fact that the majority of its land is privately owned and has mainly been handed down from generation to generation. Anguilla is also one of the few remaining British overseas territories with its own elected local government, but the Queen has a representative on the island in the form of a governor. Anguilla's trade union history differs from that of other Caribbean countries. Unions do not have a strong foothold, and this could possibly be attributed to our history of self-employment and land ownership. We were devastated by Hurricane Irma and touched by Hurricane Maria in 2017, and we are still in the recovering or rebuilding mode. As you can imagine, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an immense impact on our economy. Our borders closed on the 20th of March, and even before that, some hotels had lessened their work week or furloughed their employees. This pandemic, as did Hurricane Irma's impact, highlighted the injustices and inadequacies of our society. It has shown that workers are not protected, and there is need to diversify our economy and to provide an adequate social protection floor for all in Anguilla. The disasters have highlighted the urgency of designing and implementing these programs. Figures are being quoted that more than 3,000 persons are out of work here in Anguilla. As I said, our social protection floor is basically non-existent. And therefore, as happened after the impact of Hurricane Irma, the Social Security Board stepped in to assist contributors to the scheme with an initial for an initial 3-month period with a payment of EC $1,000 per month. The government of Anguilla has come up with a scheme also to help those who are unable for whatever reason and who do not pay into the Social Security scheme for a payment of 800 EC dollars per month. Of course, there will always be persons who fall through the cracks, and this is why social protection programs are so important. Public servant salary cuts. The rhetoric of cutting the salaries of public servants started in earnest around the 28th of April, with the heads of the staff associations being called into a meeting with the Honorable Deputy Governor. And he gave us a brief rundown of the situation. And I must say that this was the first time that we had been called into a dialogue about potential salary cuts in the history of Anguilla. He told us that a request had been made by the Premier to the British government in anticipation of the revenue shortfall Anguilla would experience as part of the pandemic, as a cause of the pandemic. The situation was vastly different to that of Hurricane Irma, when funds were given by the UK government to enable us to rebuild. The UK is going through the same situation as us, and they asked that conditions, sacrifices had to be made to enable the assistance to be forthcoming. Discussions on the potential salary cut was 10% in the initial stages. This did not sit well with the staff associations and was later reduced to a possible 5% cut. Staff associations still did not agree and sent a letter detailing that before talks of cuts, there should be a collective tightening of the government spending belt and stoppage of revenue collection leakages. We met with our members and after their input, drafted a letter and reminded the government that the current crisis builds upon a certain situation, where after a salary increase in 2008, after a number of years without a salary increase, in 2009, public servants took a 10 or 15% salary cut. This was repeated in 2010 with a further 10% cut to salaries. In 2011, an additional 3% cut was taken from public servants in the form of the interim stabilization levy. This equates to a total of 23% or 18% in the cut in the salary of public servants dependent on their salary scales. Over the period 2009 to the present, no public servant has received an annual increment. Increments were frozen and at the same time that salaries and allowances were first cut. No civil servant has continued to progress in their grade. We must point out here that progression is tied to increments. Many public servants who are below a certain grade are put to progress, sometimes over a period of 1 to 8 years. This means that despite their job being graded in a particular grade, they are underpaid for their position and have been experiencing this shortfall since 2010 for therefore 10 years. We have received a cost of living adjustment. It cannot be ignored. Nobody received a cost of living adjustment. The minister subsequently took to the House of Assembly on the 8th of May legislation entitled the Temporary Salaries Reduction Bill as a contingency measure to preserve the option to reduce public service salaries by 5% at any point between the 1st of July and the 31st of December 2020, if the need arises. The ministers and special advisors took an immediate 15% salary cut. In preparing for this panel, I wanted to present a well-rounded viewpoint of workers in Anguilla and the impact that COVID-19 had on our workforce. However, due to the absence of an active trade union in the private sector, and in particular the tourism sector, I was unable to get their true plight and was wary of any other voices coming through in the presentation. The COVID-19 response, I'm at 8 minutes, but we started meeting the end of January. A nurse was stationed at the ports and schools closed in Anguilla on the 16th of March. For 1 week in the first instance. We then officially closed our borders on the 20th of March. We did not have any confirmed cases of COVID-19 when our borders closed. But by the 26th of March, we had received at least 2 cases, and then subsequently on the 2nd of April, we got a third. The 27th of March, the temporary restrictions of movements of people and public gatherings regulations under the Public Health Act came into play. At no point was there a curfew, but persons were asked to restrict their movement during the day, unless they were essential workers, and after 6 p.m., persons were encouraged not to be on the road. The country reopened businesses and government offices, although taking established social distancing protocols into play on the 22nd of April. The first phase of schools reopening took place on the 11th of May, and the second phase on the 25th of May. I think that we may be a casualty of our own success, as with no serious casualties from COVID-19, the possibility of opening our borders is imminent. We have students who need to come home and persons who are caught outside when our borders closed. So basically, I take this opportunity to say that we all have to be safe, basically, and I will give my final remarks at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Some interesting points that I'm sure we'll explore a little later. Let's now move on to the second British Overseas Territory represented in our group today, And I invite Brother Armel Thomas, who's president of the Bermuda Public Services Union, to give us his presentation. Brother Armel is his himself a health worker. I believe he's a senior environmental health officer. And actually, this is his second stint at president of the BPSU. He previously served, I believe, up until 2011, having been president for 6 years previously. Brother Armel, too, has been very much involved in community work in Bermuda and brings to this panel a wealth of experience and some interesting experiences and stories in relation to what is happening in Bermuda in the midst of COVID-19. Brother Armel, over to you.
So, very similar to Anguilla and other countries, but I just want to give you a quick background that the arrival of COVID-19 to Bermuda shores has brought with it not only a health crisis, but an economic one as well. With record high unemployment levels being reported as a result of shutdown of Bermuda's hotels, construction projects, restaurants, bars, and retail stores. Bermuda is now facing challenges that are predicted to be far worse than the fallout experience from the 2008 global market crash. Um, Lower fiscal revenues for government are projected as a result of a severe drop in the payment of payroll tax, customs duties, hotel occupancy, remittance, cruise passenger tax for this fiscal period. Of the 1.12 billion revenue that was originally anticipated, government now estimates there will be a revenue shortfall between 175 million to 200 million. And this is coupled with, higher public spending due to the pandemic. As you realize, no country was actually budgeted for the pandemic crisis, and our 2020-21 budget was pretty tough. So this just came right on the tails of it. But in Bermuda, I can tell you today, confirmed cases is 133 in total. What we have recovered in Bermuda is 81 persons. Non-hospitalized is 36. Actively in the hospital was 7 persons. And deceased, we have 9 persons in Bermuda. The transmission status was we have about 41 imported cases. We have local transmission. It's just been a couple of clusters of local transmissions, 78 in the sources that we know. And then we have 10 local transmission sources we don't know. And then under investigation, we have 4. So our curve has been going way up. Looks like it's trying to straighten it out these days, or I'm thinking sometime in June we should reach our peak. And that's pretty good. Bermuda is currently ranked 10th in the world for screening per capita. The total up until May 23rd, we've actually tested 6,362 persons. And we, as a negative, we had 6,229 negative results. And as I said earlier, we had 133 positive results. April 4th to May 2nd, we had a shelter in place. Residents were not allowed to go out unless it was for food, medicine, gas station, or to exercise within 1 mile in an hour. At the grocery stores, we did alphabet shopping. We had overnight curfews from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and persons working from home. Significant job loss as a result in various sectors, including, like I stated earlier, of the tourism aspect of things. Then we had the phase reopening of Bermuda starting from May 2nd. And under phase 1, we had limited businesses. Phase 2 just opened last Thursday. And then hopefully sometime in June, we can move into phase 3. And this all depends on how the natives of Bermuda actually carry out the wearing of masks and a lot of things like that. And then phase 4 would actually be the reopening of airports and dining-in restaurants, bars, and clubs, and things like that. Government-funded unemployment benefits. It was available to all Bermudian and non-Bermudians who are out of work as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. The payouts went up to about $500 per week. Over 9,000 persons, which is 27% of Bermuda's labor force. The government ended up paying out about $23 million. This particularly concerns me of the sustainability of this initiative. So, I don't know. We also have this access to private pensions, which I'm very, 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 very disturbed by this. Effective June 1, all workers will be able to make a one-time withdrawal from their pension savings up to $12,000. And what concerns me is dipping into the retirement savings. In Bermuda, we have an aging civil service officers, and that's really mind-boggling. And as a union, through the trade union congress, we found lots of cuts where we can cut costs rather than touching the pensions. So it's both the private pension contribution for both employers and employees. So that's mind-boggling. We also have like this redundancy pay. Employers and employee advocacy groups are seeking relief from Bermuda's redundancy legislation. It's a lot of different things. We're talking about layoffs, employers and employers advocacy groups. What they're trying to do is an employer may lay off an employee for a continuous period not exceeding 4 months. Where the layoff for a continuous period which exceeds 4 months, it shall be deemed to be termination for redundancy, and severance will become payable. So what they're trying to do is extend that, change the Employment Act, and the unions will not have any parts of that. The pay cut for parliamentarians was amended to the mandated 12.5% reductions to the pay for parliamentarians. Suspension to the contributions to the public fund as well. And again, I don't represent the parliamentarians, but I'll be kicking up if I did. The Minister of Finance has projected a budget deficit between $275 million and $315 million, as I stated earlier. But government has stated that it needs to identify budget savings that equates to $150 million reduction. So we've came up with some things that they can actually do for that. Membership input, in keeping with the BPSU's ongoing commitment to collaboration during these challenging times, the BPSU reached out to its members to get ideas of ways the government can actually cut costs, improve efficiencies, and generate additional revenues. We received over 500 proposals in a day, and these proposals have been received and reviewed and correlated and will form a part of the union's formal submission to the government. So that was pretty good. Right now, we're negotiating with government. It's very active negotiations, and therefore I'm really unable to go into too much detail. But the union can confirm, however, that it's focused on the following areas: any agreed pay cut be based on principle or ensuring there's assured sacrifice. Because as you realize, in every country, whenever the economy goes bad, it's always taken out on the public servants, which should be assured sacrifice. Members to be provided with details of the impact that freezing contributions will have on pensions, as we talked about. There be adequate cuts in non-employment related expenses. Private sector relief, including reduction in mortgage interest rate, electric costs, food costs, health insurance premiums. This is all work if the shared sacrifice is there. And also, we've been meeting with management. The BPSU's frontline COVID-19 response team are holding meetings with the management to ensure the health and safety of its members, gather information, provide guidance on the implementation of the COVID-19 related policies and practices, discuss the budgetary impact of the pandemic on our bargaining units, develop memorandums of understanding, MOUs related to changes in the workplace practices and a result of the pandemic. And we've done about 10 of those already. Um, as I said, we did an online survey to our membership early this month to gauge the membership assessments of the unions responsive to the pandemic crisis and to obtain feedback from the membership on some proposals. We actually scored pretty high. The confidence level was 99% with a margin of error of plus or 4%. The results from the survey will serve as a general guide for the BPSU executive. Guidance to our membership. We continue to be available for all members seeking advice and guidance on employment-related matters, key membership concerns, potential pay cuts, health and safety related issues, access to PPE, working from home, challenges in work duties, and leave requests to care. We have some of the essential workers have not stopped working, and it's been finding it very difficult to find care for their children and the household. And my last little bit, just wanted to say, it's a communication aspect, which we've been very, very diligent in this. We've been sending comprehensive COVID-19 daily emails to members, which includes union updates, announcements from government, links to various helping agencies, and free training opportunities, as well as notices from our bargaining units. We've been doing regular updating on union Facebooks and websites. We've been encouraged the management of the BPSU bargaining units to provide employers with regular updates and to keep their lines of communication with their staff open. So we've also made arrangements for some of our members to have access to EPA, the Employment Assistance Programs, as well. And our community partnering, as a result, as a community partner, the BPSU is still committed to providing support to the island to this end. The BPSU's Community Outreach and Culture Committee, with the support of a team of BPSU member volunteers, has been assisting with the Salvation Army's feeding program. They've been out looking for persons that have been missing. They've also been instrumental in trying a virtual relay for life. So it's been continuous work. And I would actually finish up there for now.
Great. Thank you, Armel. Some interesting points on interesting trade union action that is also very much community focused. I'd like to suggest we take a little break from the presentations here and try to perhaps deal with a few comments and questions that we have. From our knowledge, Anguilla, and I think Sister Susan confirmed it, there are no active cases in Anguilla, one of the two countries represented in our panel where there are no current active cases. But I want to ask, what happens now that you've started to open up? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about a second wave, and what has been the testing practices in Anguilla? How are you doing with testing? How are you ensuring that in the event of this opening up, that there isn't a second wave or a resurgence of the COVID-19 among those who are currently on island and those who will come in? Sister Susan, do you have any comments to make on that?
I know that they are testing. We now have the facilities to be able to test on island. I think that the first test is supposed to be carried out sometime this week. With the opening of the borders, they have stressed that persons will have to test before they come and prove that they are COVID-19 negative. And when they arrive, they are supposed to go into 14 days quarantine in a government facility. That, of course, means an impact on the budget. Because if it's a government-run facility, that means that we will have to pay for. Well, I don't know what they're going to do. Let me say that. but I'm sure it's going to impact the budget. And the testing so far, there hasn't been a lot of testing, because of course everything has to go from here to St. Martin, then on to CARFA. But we've had about 20 tests, and that's including the 3 persons who tested positive. So that's the kind of testing. It's not been very dense.
Interesting. Uh, 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 Certainly on my mind now is what happens with the healthcare and other fundamental frontline workers, and their tests. Because obviously, as trade unions, we're also going to be insisting that those are the workers who also have to be tested. And that brings up a whole series of questions which we could probably further explore as we hear some more examples. We do have a question. We actually have 2 questions related to the COVID and the economic crisis. And I'm going to put the first one to our first 2 panelists. And it's from Henry Charles, who I'm sure many of you know. And his question is, how do you propose to engage the working class and the worker class, or sorry, the working class and working class organizations nationally and regionally to respond to the current and emerging attacks on workers and their economic and political rights? I'll read it again. How do you propose to engage the working class and working class organizations nationally and regionally to respond to the current and emerging attacks on workers' economic and political rights? And we're shooting those questions to both Susan and Armel, having given their presentations and having heard about some of the things that are happening in their respective territories.
Well, I can say from an Anguilla standpoint, as I stated in my presentation, we do not have a very strong trade union background. There, right now, the legislation that is in place, that there are no clubs, associations, or anything like that can meet with more than 25 persons. That's what the legislation states at the moment. I think that is up sometime towards the end of the month or the beginning of June. So we'll see how they amend that. But in engaging the working class, just trying to talk to persons one on one, when we meet people, we talk to them. And that's not just me, that's the members of the union as well. I must say that when we had our meeting to discuss the salary cuts, we had, I would say, triple the amount of persons who normally come to our meetings, which was good. But I really don't have any formal plan for engaging with the working class, and that's something that we definitely need to think about.
Okay. Brother Armel, any thoughts, particularly through the TUC or any other groupings to which you may be affiliated or in which you're involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, from the actual through the TUC, from the from the hoteliers, they've put something on the table, and these people are kind of like threatening the government under these conditions that hotels will close, business will leave. I'll be honest with you, they ain't going nowhere, and persons, as we've told them, if they come to the union, they can get some free information, free advice, and doesn't make sense bringing a lawyer with them because we're gonna tell them that the collective agreement supersedes any sort of agreement that you're trying to do. It even supersedes the Employment Act. So they're trying to change the Employment Act as we speak. We also recognize that some companies are trying to use this COVID as a form of getting rid of employees, and again, it's battling. You know what I mean? And it's also heartbreaking when you see and hear some of the things that people are actually coming in with. My only thing is what actually frightens me is the fact that if you have two of my members living in the same household, um, working for government, and whatever percentage you get is going to be double. You know what I mean? So these things here that we have to really talk about shared sacrifice, and that's going to be a balance. We're not saying tax is the answer. We have to come up with some really, really good austerity measures just to move forward.
Interesting points. And I think we're going to try and explore those as well a little later, because obviously the name of the game is always austerity. And it's always amazing how, at one hand, we hear that the private sector will be able to do things oh so much better. And within 6 weeks or 2 months, the very same private sector is running to the public sector for help. But as they say, I'm just going to leave that one there. Sisters and brothers, now let me introduce you to Brother Cyprian Montrop. Cyprian is the president of the St. Lucia Civil Service Association, and he's also the vice president of the Trade Union Federation in St. Lucia. Cyprian works with the Inland Revenue Service in St. Lucia as a senior tax inspector, and has always been very active in his community in St. Lucia. Brother Cyprian, I invite you now to give us some information on the situation in St. Lucia and the role that your union has been playing and is prepared to play in terms of dealing with the various attacks on the workers' rights and also on, dare I say, democratic rights of the people of St. Lucia. Over to you, Cyprian.
Thank you, Sister Sandra, and good evening, viewers. My other colleagues in the trade union movement on the panelists, Sister Hodge, Sister White, and Brother Amel. And I would also like to thank Elma Francois of Cipriani College to help us in bringing out what is happening within the region. In the case of St. Lucia, a lot has happened since the introduction of that infectious disease. Prior to it coming in, a lot of discussion was already being mooted within the society. And the workers in St. Lucia were particularly concerned with how would they have to treat with coming to the environment around them. One of the areas that was of concern to them was primarily because the employers began speaking about it also was vacation and sick leave, and was mooting that in public workers in the public service or anywhere else in the private sector similarly would have had to utilize sick leave or vacation leave as a means of staying away from work. And so the union took issue with that, and we engaged the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of the Public Service to deal with those two issues, to let them know that these are two special provisions that should not be utilized in such a pandemic. Of course, that brought fruit, and both parties agreed. That is, both ministries agreed and did send out circulars. That was at a time we had no laws enacted to deal with the pandemic as yet. And so these were policy decisions taken to allow persons not to utilize sick leave as a means of staying home or vacation leave. Some persons in the Labor Act also makes provisions for persons to voluntarily remove themselves from any workplace if they feel that their life is in imminent danger. And so that was addressed through policy, and we did not have to resort to the Labor Act because by that time, the government had enacted legislation to deal with the pandemic, and our constitution provides for the state to enact emergency laws. What to do was to give the competent authority, which is the Prime Minister, the authority to prescribe curfews, which businesses can remain open, what time can they open, and what in terms of the curfews, whether it be day or night, when can it be prescribed. Okay, as soon as the pandemic hit us, the government would have realized that we've got some cases coming into the country from non-nationals. They were treated and eventually they returned to their destinations because at that time our borders were still open. But following these two cases, these non-nationals, we recorded a total of 18 cases collectively. To date, all of those 18 cases have been recovered, and for the last 20 odd days, we have not received any new cases. But during that period, the government took the opportunity to call the unions in to have discussions on the economic and social impact of COVID-19. Well, we went to that meeting hoping that we would just be discussing a broad-based issue, and we were confined to just one topic, which was wage cuts. Basically, the government called us in, and rather than provide us with a firm proposal as to what the situation is in the country, they rather engage us in a kind of smartish way to suggest that we would just buy into it, in that they ask us to begin discussing wage cuts, providing a very number of options. We viewed that as a brainstorming exercise, and so we did not contribute to any of that discussion, but rather to say to government, if you really want to tell the union something, please provide us with firm proposals, which of course eventually on the 11th hour before the April payday, the government provided us with a proposal which we said we could not in any good conscience accept that proposal a few days before payday, as that is unconscionable because persons were not given sufficient time to prepare for any adverse effects of what is happening. And so we were able to prevent the cut at the time. But what the government did propose at that time was to ring fence our grades from 1 to 6. And in the government service of St. Lucia, we have a grading system from grades 1 to 21. Grade 1 being the lowest of the grades, which would include cleaners, and grade 21, which would include permanent secretaries, cabinet secretaries. And so there was that discussion of ring fencing, grades 1 to 6, so they would receive no cuts. And from grade 7 to 18 to have a 50% salary in cash, 50% in bonds, and the grades which are more management grades in grade 19 to 21 would have had a 25% salary in cash and 75% in bond. But my union generally represents the employees from grades 1 to 18, and so we did not enter into discussions regarding grades 19 to 21. The retirees also form part of our organization, and so they also were of concern. So the government had indicated to us that they would not be touching retirees' income. Permit me just to provide you with some background information regarding the grades and the impact of what was being done. As I indicated, grades 1 to 6 have been ring fenced, and so our salaries from grades 1 would have been in the region of $984 or equivalent $362 US. And to the top of the grades, grade 6 would have been 2,497 EC and 919 US. Those individuals would not be touched. But from grade 7, which has a salary of $2,851.52, would receive a 50% cut. What in effect that would be doing is that a grade 7 person after a cut salaries would have been equivalent to a grade 3 salary. So in other words, you're going back 3 stages. And so what we would have seen happening is persons in supervisory position, basically the income would also equate to the person that they're supervising. We were kind of perplexed as to why that kind of formula. But again, we could not engage government in that discussion, primarily because when that was presented to us, we had not met with our membership. And again, the curfew laws did not, the emergency laws did not permit for my organization to, or mass gathering. In fact, it did not allow for mass gathering. And so we could, in the normal circumstances, engage our members at that time. And so what we sought to do, before I get to that, let me just mention to you that we made some observations. During the process of the negotiations, the government mooted that in terms of how adversely it would be affecting us, that they would have had discussion with the banks and other lenders and other institutions so that we would not be adversely affected. But that did not prove to be correct, because we subsequently learned that the information coming out of those institutions clearly indicated that the government began the discussions with them after they had in fact said to the unions, yes, those institutions would have granted us those concessions. So we knew for a fact that it's a good thing that the union leaders in our country, especially those at the TUC level, are not quick to just jump to decisions, but rather we would take the careful approach. And so we saved our membership from the embarrassment of having to go to the banks and not being able to properly negotiate anything, because it was not a one-size-fits-all situation. Interestingly, during the discussions, we realized that there were no negotiations was ongoing with the other sectors with regards to salary cuts, because I mentioned we have persons from grades 1 to 21, and the grades 19 to 21, there were no negotiations with them because they do not fall within our bargaining unit. There were no negotiations with the politicians also. And while Cabinet had said that they would be taking a 25% cut, we did not see any written consent from them. And when they had provided, since they're the government, Cabinet of Ministers, to have provided the Accountant General with the request to cut their salaries by 25%. That did not happen. And also we do recognize that it's an election year. And so what we saw happening during the discussions basically was that government was again attacking only publicly, no more sacrifices being made. Another observation we made was that budget presentation, because they were asking us to take positions prior to. And we said in good conscience, we couldn't do that. We need to know what you're putting in the budget in the overall scheme of things. But the government presented a budget as if it was business as usual, and the only place that required cuts was with the public. So our union did not, what was our response? Our response was that we had reasons we wanted the public to understand that it was difficult to meet our members. So we couple statements to kind of kick things going. But what we first decided to was to meet with our general counsel and to agree to a mode of meeting and how do we meet our members. Of course, so one of the things that we did was to buy a platform where we were able to have online meetings with our members, and that's right. So we basically met with our general counsel and we took decisions. And of course, we had about 8 meetings with our members, and we, like Bermuda, we would have also done a survey to get a feel of our members, and based on that, we're in a position to take positions. What we have achieved as a union in terms of the negotiations is that we have forced the government to actually pay April and May salaries, and we're currently in the process of negotiating the June salaries. Not the ideal situation because every month our members are in limbo. In terms of government decisions based on our actions is that they have threatened to take affirmative action. The government has been out there asking us to don't tell them what to do, and using they're sitting their position in terms of they're not budging. And the last one is that we are concerned with, while we're in COVID-19, is that the government intention is to reopen the state in quick succession. One of the things we said that we're not intimidated by what is happening. So the government is fully aware of what the union's intentions are. But in terms of the government reopening the country, we participated in the meeting. Not participated. We attended the meeting, but we did not participate because it was not in our place to tell the government when to open it, because we saw that the entire country was contending whether it should, and it was becoming a political football, and we did not want to be seen as party to that. But of concern to us is that if the government opens the country as is proclaimed on June 4th of this year, our concerns is relative to the international tourists coming in. We know that our country is not fully prepared to receiving a great number of cases because our healthcare facilities are not 100% capable of doing so. And of course, of greater concern to us is the fact that we're hearing that the travelers coming in need to prove for certification that they're COVID-free. Our concern relative to that is who does the testing, who authenticates those documents, and when they, at what stage? Is it at the stage of departure? Is it 48 hours before? Because COVID-19 can be spread at any given, we can get it at any given time. On island, we consider the spread for the taxi operators, the hotel workers who has been needed to remain working in the hotels, staying in the hotels, quarantine themselves in the hotel away from work. The entire picture has not fully been thought through, and I think that the unions have its role to play in educating the masses on the implications of reopening, primarily to our source markets like the United States, which have not had any good grip of the pandemic. And like a little more, but in the interest of time, over to you, sister. Over to you, sister.
Okay, thank you, Cyprian. Quite a lot there. I'm sure that you wanted to continue talking about, and I'm sure that there'll be opportunities, if certainly not in this webinar, in other spaces to fully develop those points. Sisters and brothers, allow me now to introduce you to Sister Helene Davis White. Helene is president of the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions, that is the national center in Jamaica, and she's also the general secretary of the Jamaica Association of Local Government Officers. Helene has been a career trade unionist, and she's also very much involved in her various community activities and her own faith-based activities. Helene serves the workers throughout Jamaica as their representative on a number of different councils and committees that represent the workers' interests and also the national interests. Sister Helene, thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, and over to you, please.
Good afternoon, Sister Sandra, brothers and sisters. And also I have to say thank you to the Elma Francois Institute for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think it's very topical and very important that we are having these discussions this afternoon. Just to get right to the meat of the matter, Jamaica recorded its first case of COVID-19 on March 10. Prior to that, the government had warned that the pandemic, as it was then called, is likely to hit Jamaica and that we needed to be prepared. And so some preparatory activities were undertaken before we had our first recorded case on March 10. Those activities would have been the usual health related tips that we were asked to make sure that we in the general community observe, which is the usual hand washing, making sure that you observe physical distancing, those kinds of things. However, after the first case on March 10, many of us recognized that it was not likely to go away easily. And so one of the first things that we did in the trade union movement is to ask for a meeting of the Labor Advisory Council or the Labor Advisory Committee, which really advises the Minister of Labor on all things related to employment and labor. And so we had a meeting of the Labor Advisory Committee within days of the announcement of the first case of COVID-19. In that meeting, we focused on what needed to be done to ensure that in the event that workers had to be quarantined, that it would be possible for them to stay away from work, recognizing that our laws do not allow for paid leave for something like a pandemic. You have paid sick leave, but then in the case of a pandemic and quarantine, it would not technically be noted as sick leave. And so therefore we said to our partners that we needed to ensure that workers would not lose any pay by virtue of them following whatever directives were given in respect to quarantining. And so recommendations were made that the government needed to make put in place some kind of program that could ensure that workers are paid if they had to be home as a result of quarantining. Just as an aside, the government in its budget had allocated $10 billion, I believe, for activities related to COVID-19. And as they indicated, then it was more something that they wanted to put aside, but not that they wished for a COVID-19 case in Jamaica. So what we basically said to the government is that that $10 billion should be utilized to ensure that workers would be able to stay away from work, and that in respect to our small businesses, that they would be able to follow directives in terms of closure of business and so on, because they would now be able to collect monies from the government that would more or less tide them over until they were through with whatever are the directives from the government. Suffice it to say that within a couple of weeks of our meeting, the government, the cabinet approved of a program which they have called the CARE program that dealt with most of what we had put forward in that Labor Advisory Council meeting, where workers who have been laid off as a result of the pandemic, that is, workers who would have been laid off since March 10, would be eligible to receive salary support in the order of $9,000 per fortnight, if my memory serves me right. And the also programs to encourage employers not to lay off workers. They would get payroll assistance to a similar tune of $9,000 per fortnight. And in addition, payments were made, are being made to small businesses in particular areas such as barbers and hairdressers, who all had to close as a result of the pandemic, and also a compassionate grant that any Jamaican who is not benefiting from any of the other programs can apply for, and that is in the order of a one-time payment of $10,000 as a compassionate grant. While as trade unions, we recognize that much of what we had put on the table had been addressed, we felt that the amounts that were allocated were woefully small amounts, and we were not sure how that would assist persons who were receiving salaries of much higher amounts than what the government is paying out. And the additional thing is that the government indicated that these payouts would only be made to workers who earned under $1.5 million, which is the income tax threshold per year. And so it meant that there are workers who would have been excluded because they are earning over the income tax threshold. All right, that being the case, though, what we had to now focus on, certainly in respect of the public sector, is to ensure that our members would also be able to go through any period of quarantine without loss of pay, and that was also done, where public sector workers can get special leave if they have to be going through any period of quarantine. And it may not only be quarantine, if a particular area, community has been locked down and the workers are unable to leave, then the special leave would apply, so those workers would lose no pay at all, and it would not be docked from their vacation leave or their sick leave. The other thing that we ensured happened in the instance of somebody having to be quarantined or workers having to adjust their working hours to be able to deal with curfews that are in places, that we negotiated for transportation arrangements for workers who had to be traveling during curfew hours. And I know in our health sector, that figured, that was a big concern for most health sector workers, how they were to get to and from work. In the initial days of the pandemic, you had persons, taxis refusing to take them on once they were in their uniforms, because there was this thing about, whether or not they'd be passing on the COVID, because they recognize that they are coming or going to a hospital, and we had to intervene there to ensure that they could be transported safely to and from work. A number of things were done in the public sector, and most of it was done with the discussions with unions and workers. We have had no instance of a pay cut. None has been asked for by the government. In fact, in a meeting we had, I think it may have been last week or the week before, with the Minister of Finance, he indicated that they were not looking at any kind of pay cut or layoffs in the public sector, but that, well, the caveat being, if the economic situation doesn't worsen, then there would be no likelihood of pay cuts or layoffs in the public sector. So we are still very vigilant, because one of the things that we have put forward is that I think the government has to take note of the fact that the workers who are on the front line in this pandemic are public sector workers, or health workers, or sanitation workers are the ones who are on the front line. Many persons who would not have spoken up, so to speak, for public sector workers are now praising public sector workers for the kind of service they have been giving during the pandemic. And we have sought to try and take advantage of that goodwill in this point, at this point in time, because ever so often members of the population tend to be influenced by our politicians or policymakers, who constantly point to the size of the wage bill, and by doing so saying that the public service is taking up too much of our government's available resources. But what we see now is that there is a kind of goodwill out there for public sector workers that we are seeking to ensure remains in place. One of the things that we have found among our public sector members is that they have been very amenable to change. And I say that because recognizing the problems that we would have had in terms of being able to continue providing service in the context of curfews and so on. Many public sector workers have adjusted their working hours to take account of that. Not that they are working more hours in any particular week, but they have amended their normal work day to ensure that they are not traveling at the time when our public transportation is at its peak. And so whereas we would have had, like in our health sector, 3 shifts, we are now down to 2 shifts. And many of the workers have been the ones who have suggested it rather than it being imposed on them. In areas where they have attempted to impose, of course, workers have rejected it. But where workers and management have sat and looked at the issues, we have invariably come away with workers agreeing to have adjustments to their normal work days such that they are able to travel to and from work without exposing themselves to any undue risk. In one particular instance, and I must say that I was really surprised, our firefighters, their working arrangements were 8 hours on and 24 hours off. They have adjusted it to 24 hours on and 3 days off. And they are enjoying it so much that they have said that we need now to amend our collective bargaining agreement to reflect that kind of arrangement. And of course, we have to caution, but they are the ones who are experiencing it. They like the fact that they can be home for 3 whole days with their families. Some of them say with 3 days, they may be able to pick up another job. Whatever it is, they seem to be liking it, and they are the ones who are coming to us now as unions. One, we had to agree to extending it for another 60 days, and I've had to caution to say that that is something that is enshrined in the Act, the Fire Brigade Act, and so cannot be changed at will or willy-nilly. But what it says to me is that workers, although some persons would want to characterize workers as beings, that human beings that are locked into situations and are not amenable to change, I have not found that to be so in the period of this pandemic. Just to close off, to indicate that we did have a period in Jamaica when we had a steep rise in the number of cases, and that came as a result of an employer not adhering to protocols that were put in place for the BPO sector. And so we had what was called a workplace cluster. And of our 500, and I think we are at about 570 cases now, approximately close to 300 of those came from that workplace cluster. So that tells you what can happen when you have employers who are willing to sacrifice workers' health and safety on the altar of the what some persons call the almighty dollar. Happy to say that we seem to be now on a downward trajectory from that peak. And one of the things that we as unions put forward, along with our private sector partners, is that we needed to be out there very early in the day, looking at how it is that we are going to be recovering, how it is that our economy can recover from this pandemic, recognizing that because our economy is largely dependent on tourism and tourism-related activities, we have had over 300,000 workers being laid off as a result of the pandemic. Some are actually facing redundancy if things do not pick up very shortly. And also, one of the things that we recognize is that our country was not really locked down as such, so manufacturing continued. In fact, one of the things that I noticed is that the list of essential services was expanded. And so persons who were going to work in manufacturing industry were suddenly essential. And so our manufacturing industries did not close. But the reality is that there are several persons, or informal sector has suffered immensely as a result of the pandemic, because they are the ones who do not have the ability to adhere to or to implement the things that are needed. And in terms of physical distancing, a lot of the services that are provided by the informal sector do not sit well with physical distancing. And so they have had severe problems. And so what we said needed to be done is that we have to have a plan as to how we recover. We did not want to go the route of the government of 2008, when the financial sector was experiencing problems right across the world. Our government then was saying that it presented opportunities. And so rather than planning for it, we were sort of caught flat-footed, and it took us 10 years basically to begin to see ourselves coming out of that period. We did not want a repeat of that. And so as a result of the calls that were made by the private sector, by the unions, the government established a economic recovery task force that has as its major task the development of a plan that will see Jamaica's economy being revived in the shortest possible time. The task force comprises members from the private sector, from the unions, from academia. Also, we have a representative from the National Partnership Council on that task force. I must say the task force is heavily weighted in favor of the private sector. Initially, we only had one union representative, and then after I intervened, they added another. But what we have also been able to do is get them to agree that on the various subcommittees that are established, that we can co-opt union members, union officers into those committees, and we have done that. So we have union officers being members of almost all of the subcommittees of the Economic Recovery Task Force. Importantly, the task force is not seeing itself as a long-term entity. It is there to develop, and then the public sector and the other bodies have to implement. And so we have about 5 to 6 weeks that would have been from the last weekend in April. And so we are supposed to be concluding our work by the first to the second week in June. Just to note that despite the fact that work is going on in that task force, and I would say, to my mind, very good work being done, because we have the participation and the involvement of the various stakeholders. One of the committees is really providing that health-related focus on economic recovery, recognizing that as far as we are concerned, anything about economic recovery has to be underpinned by the health consideration. And so there's one committee that has that job to look clearly at what are going to be the health considerations and the things that need to be done in terms of ensuring workers' health and safety, as well as health and safety of clients of the system as well. And then the other committees are really those areas that are seen to be very important to the economy. So tourism and aviation is a very important committee. We have one that looks at what we call local services, which is really the small and medium enterprises, and how what will be needed for them to recover as well. We have manufacturing, we have agriculture, all of the areas that we identified as being very important for any economic recovery. Despite all of that, though, and I'm closing up now. Despite all of that, though, we have had calls and pressures being placed on the government by some of our private sector partners who are demanding a date from the government for reopening. And we have resisted that. According to them, that date is necessary, especially in relation to tourism, because other islands in the Caribbean are opening up. And if that happens, we are doomed because we will not be able to get flights in, etc., etc. But we keep maintaining that we have to await the final outcome of the task force, because the task force looks at everything, looks at the bigger picture. Some of the times, because you're in a particular industry, you're not able to see what is happening outside that will impact not only your sector, but the entire economy. And we are saying just wait a couple of weeks and the task force report will deal with all of that. And in respect to tourism, because it's in that area in particular that people seem to want dates. The committee is tourism and aviation. So it means, therefore, that because we're looking at everything, in order for tourism to open up, we have to look at how we can open up our borders, because our tourists come from outside of Jamaica. What needs to be done to ensure that we can open up our borders and open up safely, recognizing that we have just about 8,000 Jamaicans that are outside of Jamaica wanting to come home. And if they come home, they are being told that they have to serve a 14-day quarantine. Is that going to apply to tourists? If it is not going to apply to tourists, why and how? So these are the broader picture things that we think need to be settled, and it can best be settled in the environment of the task force than in private sector leaders seeking to pressure the government to announce a date when our borders will be opened up. So in closing, I don't think we have done everything right, but I think we have been able, utilizing social dialogue, to deal with most of the issues in a non-confrontational way. And we have, as trade unions, been able to make our voices be heard, both on the larger stage and at the level of the task force and the various agencies of government. And we will continue to do our work to ensure that the interests of workers are best dealt with by our policymakers and indeed the entire Jamaican society. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Helene. Some very important points raised there. And that brings us, in fact, to a couple of the questions that we have from our viewers and our listeners. If I can quickly refer to one in particular, it asks, is COVID responsible for the economic crises our countries are facing? Or is it that the COVID crisis has simply accentuated the irrelevance of our economic and governance models? And I'm going to shoot that one to you, Helene, given particularly your role on your national task force and the kind of information that you have been dealing with over the last couple of weeks, and also some of the thoughts that you would have had talking to the various unions, not only in the public sector, but also those in the private sector. I'll repeat the question. Is COVID responsible for the economic crises our countries are facing? Or is it that the COVID crisis has simply accentuated the irrelevance of our economic and governance models? What say you, Helene?
I think it has, I don't think it is a cause of the crisis. I think it has accentuated the problem, really, because what has happened in most Caribbean economies is that we are open economies, and the kinds of policies that we have implemented over the years have exposed us even more to the vagaries of the international economic arrangements, because we are so heavily dependent on areas like tourism. And in our situation, business process outsourcing, which was seen as a major area that we needed to encourage in Jamaica. The fact is that what we have seen as a result of COVID is that it has unleashed the creativity and innovation that was not encouraged, I don't believe, of Jamaicans, because the kind of economic model that we were supporting wasn't one that took that into account. It was more outward looking. And I'm not saying that we should not be outward looking, but when you're outward looking, you have to recognize the downside to that is that you are going to be particularly vulnerable to what happens outside of your country and what COVID has done, because nearly all of our cases in Jamaica have been imported cases. And so what it has done is shown us how vulnerable we are, and that, to my mind, we should therefore be devising economic policies and an economic program that doesn't make us so reliant on others, but we have to become more reliant on ourselves, or innovation, or creativity, etc., to take us out of whatever problems we have rather than relying on others.
Excellent point, Pauline. I have two other questions that I'd like to shoot to between them, Armel and Cyprian. The first one says, statistically speaking, the percentage of non-unionized workers, or let's just say potential members, is substantially larger than unionized workers. In light of this, what strategies can unions develop to mobilize and cover these workers? I'm going to repeat. Statistically speaking, the percentage of non-unionized workers is substantially larger than unionized workers. In light of this, what strategies can unions develop to mobilize and cover these workers? I'm going to shoot that one to Brother Cyprian.
Okay, thanks, sister. Well, one of the things that we have realized, especially in our public service in St. Lucia, is that there are lots of young individuals who are in the service. And the challenge that we have now is that whereas before we had career public servants going up through the ranks, waiting for retirement. What we have now is that there is a shift to NIC, and because of that, persons don't see the need
NIC, I
Sorry.
think you need to explain.
National Insurance Corporation paying Social Security. And so persons don't necessarily see the need to stay in the service. But one of the things that we have been discussing and toying around is that we need to move away from just being the traditional trade union that just deal with the grievances and all of those things, because we need to focus on what are the things that these young workers are really interested in, so that we can work with them in bringing them into the union. Because one of the biggest questions that has been asked is, what am I getting from the union? Because when you negotiate, I get it anyway, so there is no need for me to be in there. And so we have to develop either in social programs where we can engage them, and educational programs where we can engage them, and even at the entry level into the service, that will begin to play a bigger role in the orientation. And one of the things that has hampered us a bit is the quietness of the union in talking about its achievements and what it can do for workers. We don't do much of that, so people don't really know of our existence, excepting that it's a union from historical time with a name, but not necessarily in the current dispensation. So we have to be a little more involved in what is happening, and to be more in the faces of the workers, and to allow what has been stifling the young workers in particular a voice, because normally they are not seen as a voice. And so if we give them that voice, I believe that they will be in a position to see more joining the union. But also we have to have a battle with government with regards to the growth and development in the workplace, because they always ask, what are we doing? And unless we can show them that we are working assiduously with all employers to make sure that their voices are heard and their dreams are realized within the workplace, unless we do some of those things, we would not see much. But we have, as a union collectively now, we have not started any programs really per se, but these are things that we have been toying with in terms of getting workers to be engaged, and not only young workers, but generally workers in both the public and the private sector to become unionized. Because we have a very, as you rightly said, it's a very, very small percentage of our population, working population that is unionized. Over to you, sister.
Great. Okay. Here's another question. What are the union's plans to keep membership alive? As it seems clear, most persons are going to be challenged financially. And that's coming from, I recognize this name, Jamie Joseph. I'm going to repeat. What are the union's plans to keep membership alive? As it seems clear, most persons are going to be challenged financially. Brother Armel, any thoughts on that? Any plans that the TUC in Bermuda has, given that you've got a large number of workers who are in the hotel and catering sector who are um, really terribly affected by all of this?
Um, because the hotels don't come under the Bermuda Public Services Union, I can say basically that the union that actually represents the hotels, they've come up with different ideas in regards to uh, layoffs. Within the hotels, there's a lot of layoffs. So instead of taking the same person and that same person working all those times and hours, they've actually, the union has come up with rotating those persons so everybody gets a little piece of the pie rather than using the same people all the time. So that's being innovative. And then the hoteliers went to a lawyer just to get a simple question like that. This is why I stated earlier that this information is free. They just need to come to the unions and ask questions and use that collaborative approach. And if they can use that collaborative approach, the unions can actually help them define and fine tune some of the issues. Now, your other question that you made mention in regards to uh, um, persons in the private sector, how they view unions and those types of things there. I think that was from somebody who had a question out there. I would like to say this, and also state it quite frankly. Every trade unionist, our forefathers, they worked hard for where we are today. If you're out sick, they came from the unions. You get a vacation, they came from the unions. So persons that are non-unionized and receiving these benefits are basically, their companies are acting like unions. So what we basically try to encourage, I mean, we got one sector that is very highly much unionized, and then I can say probably the different sector inside that same organization have personal contracts. Guess what you think the employer is doing? They're actually doing all number of different things to these people, which are upset. And here I am, and I'm going to encourage and still try to encourage to get them to join the union. You know what I mean? So, and I'm saying that because they're doing whatever they want to do to these people, you know, and they're good out getting lawyers together because they can't afford this and they can't afford it. So before they sign contracts, people should sit down and think. The unions, some people view the unions as just actually striking, striking, striking. You get a lot of things done across the table, a lot of things done. Mediation aspect, before all of those strikes things come into perspective. You know, the unions today, what we can do is continue to educate the young ones. It should be in the school system. We have a few books that are out. Persons don't even know who certain people are. You know what I mean? So I think it's important to recognize that everybody is operating like a union. Even the private sector who's not got a union organized in that area, but people get paid and they go vacation, sick time, all of that comes from us. So I just want to make sure that people that, you know, if you're not in a union, please recognize it where contracts come from.
Great. Again, you're emphasizing the importance of social dialogue and certainly the broader picture of social partnerships, because we've had quite a couple of examples in these discussions about where unions have actually sat down. In some cases, have actually precipitated the move in terms of going to the table and making some suggestions. I have one final question, and I'm going to throw it out to both Susan and Helene. Specifically for Susan, one part of the question, given what you were saying about workers in Anguilla, what plans do you have afoot to unionize those non-unionized workers in Anguilla? And how are you looking at working with others, particularly those that you've talked about in some of the private sector unions and associations that I'm aware that started in Anguilla? Any plans afoot, and how will you be working with your regional sisters and brothers to get that happening? Susan?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sister Sandra. It's a difficult one to answer, but I know that before COVID-19, for instance, we had plans to have a worker's rights, understanding what a trade union is, what rights you have as a worker. We had that planned as a series of programs that we were going to do, and we were going to target persons. We have been into the schools, for instance. We have been asked by some of the business places to come in and talk. We have done that. Getting the non-unionized persons, it is difficult because they are resistant. I think that I remember in one of the presentations that you gave, you said that a crisis is something about it shouldn't go to waste. And I think that this crisis is really showing persons, along with Hurricane Irma, the fact that the hotels, for instance, had insurance, and their insurance would have covered the wages of their workers. But rather than do that, they actually sent the workers home, and they couldn't do anything. We don't have collective bargaining agreements. And I think that's something that we need persons to understand, that that's a process that we can go through. Trying to get the message out there and let persons understand that a union is not just about salaries and grievances, as Cyprian and Amel have already said, that we are part of the system, that we are truly part of the system. I mean, in my Labor Day address, I had to say, that public servants are not these airy fairy people who float above the world. We are taxpayers. We are workers. We shop in the same shops.
Susan.
Sorry.
Anguillians are taxpayers. Have things changed in Anguilla over the years?
The taxes that the few taxes that we pay.
3% levy. Okay.
Well, yes, I take that into consideration, but I also think, leading on from what you just said there, I think that there is a need for a fair, just, and equitable tax system to be put in place, because what the crises have shown us is that there is a need for unemployment benefit. There is a need for assistance because hurricane season is 6 days away. What happens in the midst of a pandemic? If we get a hurricane, how are we going to deal with that? That exacerbates the situation. And I think that persons are realizing that there is a need to cover themselves, and the union can help them do that. And we're going to try and get the message out there. I have to get all my colleagues on board. And you asked about the region. I have so many resources in the region. I'm looking at 4 right now, and there are so many ways that we can talk. We can find out how we can do things together. So I mean, especially with Zoom and with the program that we're meeting on now, it makes it a lot easier to collaborate and to get the message across to workers. So we're going to try and do something like that, try and get social media and try and use a platform that I would never have thought of using to organize workers before COVID-19, probably using this platform to get to our workers, to the potential members.
Okay, so the comment that I usually make, sisters, brothers, and allies, is that a crisis is too good a thing to waste, and I've borrowed that from many years ago, with a former Secretary of State, I believe, in the Obama administration. But certainly we do have, as we look on things and we recognize people are questioning our economic systems or economic models, issues relating to taxation, issues relating to the profit driven motives of a number of not only international businesses, but certainly our own businesses here in the Caribbean, who seem to be thinking more of profit and not recognizing that you have to put the people over the profit. I'm going to give the last word, if I may, to Sister Helene in light of some of the discussions that we've had, and obviously there's so many areas that we have not been able to touch on in this discussion. But I'd like to ask Helene to give us some insight into how she sees our work continuing as Public Services International and our affiliates in the Caribbean. We've been discussing our role in the living with COVID-19 period and the work that we have to get involved in as trade unionists in our various territories, and especially at a regional level. Helene, having had your experiences in your national task force in Jamaica, what are some of the key points? What are some of the two or three takeaways that you'd like or listeners or audience to have based on those experiences and your own thoughts and projections for making sure that we have a better world? Over to you, Helene.
Yes, so I'm saying that from our experiences with the Economic Recovery Task Force, and I would say it even predates the Economic Recovery Task Force, from how we have been able to manage our economic program when we were in a borrowing relationship with the IMF, where we basically utilized the social dialogue approach and had all stakeholders at the table. We have found that to be a very useful way of arriving at decisions as to how the country should be managed and the various programs that should be in place, and ensuring that we also hold our policymakers' feet to the fire as well. So we continue to endorse the social dialogue approach. I know that for many of us, the approach does not seem to, well, it does not seem to sit squarely with the kinds of activities that we would normally be engaged in as trade union activists. Many persons see it as us giving up, so to speak. But when persons come to me with that idea, I would sort of identify, iterate for them what are the achievements that we have had as a result. And that is coming on the backs of several years of, well, almost not just years, probably lifetime of adversarial relationships between workers and private sector and government. And we have recognized that when we seek to come together to solve our nation's problems, that's when we seem to be at our very best. Of course, though, that approach has as its bedrock trust and confidence. If there's no trust and confidence, that approach cannot work. And so I know in Jamaica's case, we had to have several trust building exercises, and we had to do it incrementally. Some of you may recall that in the earlier periods of the late 80s into the 90s, early to mid 90s, we had to engage in what we call memoranda of understandings. And in that process of working with social partners in that memoranda of understanding, which rescued our bauxite sector, rescued our banana industry, etc., we were able to build the trust and confidence in the social and among social partners that enabled us to come to the point where we were able to institutionalize, so to speak, our economic program oversight committee, and from there a national partnership arrangement. I think that going forward, we have to go into exercises like these, recognizing first and foremost what it is that we want out of it. And it's not just an opportunity to go and, as we say in Jamaica, beat up your chest and talk a lot. It is about identifying what you want to achieve and identifying the way in which you're going to achieve that goal. Because it may be that at some points in time you may need to be out on the streets making a lot of noise to get that done, and in other instances you may need to be at the bargaining table hammering out agreements that actually support what it is. As far as the public sector is concerned, I think we have to quickly hold on to the goodwill, so to speak, that has been that has been thrown our way as a result of people recognizing the hard work that public sector workers have put in this period, and recognizing that the public sector is more than just a group of persons who receive a paycheck. These are persons who deliver important services to you, the citizens of our individual territories. We now have to devise plans and programs that can build on that. So when we're talking about people over profit, they recognize what that is. Because if we were actually observing people over profit in the last several years with the neoliberalist model, we would not have been in the kind of problem some of us have been in our health sector, because the notion was coming out of that model that you had to cut the size of your public sector, you had to contract out services. We are now recognizing how important that is, because if we look at sanitation services in our hospitals, that was contracted out. Now we are recognizing that the best way to deliver it is by public sector workers who can be properly trained and who can properly deliver those services, rather than by contractors whose only be all and end all is profit, and it cannot be profit over people. So I think that is what this pandemic gives us, an opportunity to build relationships with our citizens, build relationship with our workers and with other partners, recognizing the importance of public services to our individual territories.
Thank you, Helene. Very well said. And I want to thank our listeners and our viewers for joining us, and of course, our panelists and our team at the Elma Francois Institute for working with us, helping us through this webinar. And if I may make the kind of plea, we do need to continue this conversation. And let me end off with a statement from PSI's General Secretary, Rosa Pavanelli. We should be pressing our governments, advocating for change in the economic direction of our economies. Sisters and brothers, public is back. We matter, we deliver for you. Thank you all very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.